President Zelenskyy says he's not reached a deal with President Trump on ceding Ukrainian land after the US president accused him of not reading his peace plan properly. President Zelenskyy had an in-person meeting with Sir Keir Starmer, France's Emmanuel Macron, and Germany's Friedrich Merz in Downing Street today, with the European leaders discussing the future of the Donbass, which Russia has claimed. This is Trump talking about President Zelenskyy last night.
I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed that President Zelenskyy hasn't yet read the proposal. That was as of a few hours ago. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia's fine with it. Russia, I guess, would rather have the whole country when you think of it. But Russia is, I believe, fine with it.
Well, let's talk to Justin Logan, Director of Defence and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute in Washington. Good evening to you, Justin.
Good evening, Carol.
Even before this meeting in Downing Street today, President Trump was accusing European leaders of having unrealistic expectations on the Ukraine peace deal. Do you think anything that was said today at number 10, talking about the need for these robust security guarantees and so on, is President Trump going to accept any of that?
No, I think that by all evidence we have at this point, what happened today was the three European leaders were consulting with President Zelenskyy, not on how to deal with Vladimir Putin, but on how to deal with Donald Trump. For better or worse, the United States is still the linchpin of this operation. And I think that the push for maximalism on the part of Starmer, Macron, and Merz, which apparently they've urged on Zelenskyy now, it's a bit like seeing the same movie over again. We're back to U.S. security guarantees and Ukraine's constitution forbidding the cession of territory. So it seems to me like we're just going around in circles here.
Yeah, I mean, it really does have a rather depressingly familiar ring to it, all of this. And I mean, the key thing here has really been that Russia, President Putin, has shown absolutely no indication that he's prepared to give up on any of his key demands to seize the whole of Donbass, have no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, restrictions on the size of Ukraine's army. And it seems as though President Trump is just far more prepared to listen to him than he is to President Putin, that is, than he is to President Zelenskyy or the European supporters that he has.
Well, I've been a bit perplexed all along about the idea that Putin should be making concessions up front, right? The way, I don't know how cars are purchased in the UK, but when you buy a car in the United States, you come in and say, I'm not even really looking for a car. I might be willing to think about a car. And then the two sides sort of dance around and try and see if they could come together. The other confounding variable here is that in a gradual, brutal, cumulative way, Vladimir Putin knows that he has the upper hand on the battlefield. We've been talking about the collapse of Ukrainian positions around Pokrovsk. We've been talking about endemic manpower issues inside Ukraine. And now we're talking about additional pressure on the domestic front in the form of the sacking of his top advisor, Andriy Yermak, due to a corruption probe. So unfortunately, the realities on the battlefield and in political terms are going to bear heavily on who comes in with the upper hand to negotiations.
So do you think that it is that President Trump actually just sees President Putin as the stronger leader here because he seems to be prepared to pile ever more forces and armor at Ukraine and is very gradually taking more territory? Or I mean, we're also hearing, aren't we, about the fact that the Russians are now dangling various deals in front of President Trump, talking about how they could do a deal on rare earth minerals and so on.
Yeah, I don't know the extent to which it's about the strength of the leaders, but rather the contributions of secular realities about Ukraine's economy versus Russia's economy, Ukraine's population versus Russia's population. I mean, this is just like a much larger country bullying a much smaller country. And the former dictator of Mexico once said, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. So it's a rough business living next to an ambitious major power. And so I don't know that it's about the strength of the leaders as much as it is the size and power of the countries. And I do think that Trump understands that the idea that Ukraine is going to recover an advantage on the battlefield is sort of fanciful at this point. And so we're definitely in the order of least worst outcomes rather than good outcomes.
But yet he seems to be ignoring the fact that, it was Russia that started the war. He seems to be accusing Ukraine of perhaps raising unrealistic ideas. But that is about hanging on to territory that the Russians have seized illegally.
There's no question it's illegal. And I think that the president doesn't pay a lot of attention to international law one way or the other. That's been demonstrated in our own hemisphere here as much as it has been demonstrated on the European continent. But I think that to grapple with the fundamental realities of this conflict don't involve much sort of moral vindication. In a certain sense, the bad guy is going to get away with it. And the question is whether you feel as though you can you can create some sort of total victory, some sort of unconditional surrender on the part of Russia. And I think that the answer to that question is and has been clearly no. And so, yes, there's a certain bracketing away of moral calculation here that's going to be necessary if we want to bring this thing to an end. And to try to continue it at a rate that it has been continued for the past almost 4 years now just strikes me as not in the cards. The United States is not going to do another $60 or $70 billion supplemental ad infinitum until Russia is defeated. And, the other reality is that, for better or worse, the Americans have been doing everything but pulling the trigger, including on deep strikes into Russia. They've been providing surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, and a number of other things that whatever Emmanuel Macron may have to contribute to diplomacy, he cannot replace. So without the United States providing very serious aid and assistance to Ukraine, this thing could get much worse very quickly. And I think all sides would be well advised to countenance that.
And this comes as we had that national security strategy document out at the end of last week, which, went well beyond security issues, didn't it, really? It was hugely critical of many EU nations for the way they run their countries, their immigration policies, their approach to free speech and so on. And that seems to underline or underpin the US president's entire approach to European leaders.
I think the main bogeyman in Europe in the NSS was the European Union itself. And the United States has always been ambivalent at best about the European Union, right? We liked it in the 1950s and 1960s in the form of the EEC, right? Trying to get countries that had been destroyed by World War II back on their feet so they wouldn't be subject to Soviet predation. But at other times where it looked like the EU was going to take a much stronger role on security policy, the Americans went to great lengths to squash those initiatives because it displaced American primacy on the continent. But I do think that you're quite right that the NSS laid out an American approach to Europe in the main that is focused on one-on-one sort of bilateral relationships with nation states, not relations with the EU, and really a shot across the bow, as you mentioned, on free speech, on migration, and on other issues. So this is the Europeans have a sort of multi-front diplomatic struggle on their hands to include Ukraine, but also the broad arc of U.S. policy.
Justin Logan, Director of Defence and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Great to get your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.